UC students. It's a pleasure to be with you again and to have a little time of review. We're going to begin with the art movements of 19th through 20th century Western art. So this covers a time period from 1850 to 1980 in the Common Era. Okay, let's take a look at and review what the art movements of the 19th century are. Beginning with 1850, you had realism, and this roughly covered the time period between 1848 and 1860. Now, remember that we spoke about the fact that art movements are exactly that. Roughly a time period where this was the thing in art history. And they're usually very short-lived, as you will see. 1874 started Impressionism. And by way of reminder, each period is basically a repudiation of the preceding one. It's usually a reaction to the preceding one. So that's 1872 to 1880. In 1886, we had Post-Impressionism, 1880 to 1890s, and also, by way of commentary, many people confuse works of Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, or they lump them together, but they're two distinct periods. And as we go through our review, I want to make sure that I emphasize which works are Impressionist and which are Post-Impressionistic. 1890, we had Symbolism, and that lasted through the 90s, and then beginning with 1900, roughly, to 1914, so 1890s more or less to 1914, we had Art Nouveau. Now, art history is always a reflection of what is happening in society. And during this entire time period, we have a brand new environment. Those of you that are listening to this video will have grown up your entire lives having had access to cell phones and social media, and everything is at your fingertips. But that wasn't always the case. Even when I was born, the advent of television had just started, and of course we had toilets, we had running water, etc. And that had not been in effect for a great amount of time, but right at the time of the Industrial Revolution, which we cover periods during that time, you're going to see that the advancements in the world as far as technology, food, clothing, heat, sanitation, the things that I just mentioned, were imploding. So the environment was faster paced. We had major innovations in the items that we see listed here, and that created time for leisure, which goes back to when we had the beginning of time, when you had civilizations that were beginning. What always happened? You had cities that emerged and civilizations that emerged generally by rivers, like the Tigris, Euphrates, for instance. And what happened was people became civilized, quote unquote, when they had enough leisure time, i.e. they were producing enough food so that they had time to create art and do other things that did not have to do specifically with just the concept of survival. So what are we seeing? We're seeing department stores. Before this time, things were very specialized. You had a mixing of social classes in an urban setting. Until recently, many societies, or most societies, had social stratas, and we're seeing more and more how the world has come to a consensus, let's say, to make the statement that they don't want that anymore. They want more openness, they want more diversity, they want more inclusion, etc. Okay, so now we have a shift from past values and people fascinated with the past. In art particularly, it was the Greco-Roman world, and now we're moving towards modern art for what they call a modern era. Let's take a look at realism and the realist painters. Okay. So the realists were artists that believed that in the concept of painting, you could experience paintings with your senses. So Gustave Courbet, who was one of the world's greatest artists, said, if I can't see it, I should not paint it. And realism is history painting, and it's about real life and things that have actually happened. So the belief during this time was that art should have social consciousness and that it would awaken the self-involved Parisian to contemporary concern. The good, the bad, and the ugly. So what had happened? People in Paris were interested in things that were true, beautiful, wonderful, praiseworthy. And so realism was like, no, I don't think so. There are a lot of things happening in society that are bad and that are ugly, and we want to portray those. Okay, so what are the characteristics? In the Renaissance, they were looking for beauty, they were looking for symmetry, they were looking for perfection. Now it's a rejection of what Renaissance stood for. So now you have what is known as less of an emphasis on the illusion of space. Okay, so they rejected that from the Renaissance. They were introducing the use of photography and printmaking to provide social commentary, and I will elaborate on that accordingly. So what were these new themes? You had peasants who were depicted with reverence, daily life that was depicted honestly and sincerely. You had topics that dealt with the earth and the landscape, and you also had a color palette, brown and ochre. Now, let's break this apart a little bit. In the Renaissance, if you recall when we looked at the piece by Sandro Botticelli, which was The Birth of Venus, you saw that illusion of space. Now, if you look at these paintings, you will see that that has been lost. They're not trying to portray something exactly the way that it is, and they're not trying to give you that 3D perspective, but rather saying, hey, we're painting on a canvas. This is not supposed to be something that's real life. This is an impression of something. We want it to look in a way that you see that it is a painting. At the same time, we don't want to sugarcoat things. We want to present them the way that it's happening right now. Okay, so let's look at Olympia, the item or the piece rather that we saw in the previous slide. So Olympia is a painting by Edouard Monet, who is a Parisian, and he had different themes that he wanted to elaborate upon in his work. So he had the issues of stereotypes. He was inspired by Titian's Venus of Urbino. There was a stark contrast of colors and no idealization. So what do we know of Olympia? Olympia was the name given to prostitutes at the time. You see that she is laying down. You see that right here we have a line that is cutting into the canvas. You see the maid that is portrayed by a black woman, and we see flowers that were brought in by a suitor, and she's looking at the audience defiantly. She has her hand resting here, and her feet are inordinately small for her body. So when Manet presented this work to the Academy, it was frowned upon, and they thought it was horrendous. They didn't like it. They thought it was a disgrace. They thought you should never portray a nude in this manner. That if you had a nude, the only type of nude you could really have up until that time was one that was a mythological character, so that it would not be something that was offensive to women in general. But she was a Parisian, and at the time, men in Paris had mistresses, and that's what he was trying to portray, the truth of Parisian life at the time. Okay, now Impressionism, the true modernist movement symbolized by avant-garde artists. So what is an avant-garde artist? Anything or anyone that's avant-garde means that you are ahead of your time, you are moving towards something that has not been experienced yet, and that people want to portray, but totally breaking all the norms from the past, right? So in this case, we're talking about a group of artists that reject traditional approaches, and they want to have new techniques. And the reason it says that it's an experimental technique is you don't know how your audience is going to receive it. So in every work, when you study a work of art, you look at the form. What is it made of? What does it portray? You look at the function. What was the purpose of this painting? Content. What is included in the painting? In the case of Olympia, it's a prostitute. There's a maid that's bringing her flowers. We also have a bed and linens, etc. So that would be the content. And then the context is, how was this piece received? What is happening in society at the time? So the feeling that the Impressionists wanted to convey was one of transience, which means it's the passing of time, but very quickly. Something transient happens very, very quickly. It's fleeting. There's a sense of impermanence, meaning you can't get your hands on it because it's like a vapor. There's a lack of finish, and they just want you to look at it and say, wow, this is just like a vapor, a fleeting impression. So the context of these works was that they were not well received when they first became known and they were being exposed to the public. So the Impressionist completed works looked like sketches. They looked like they were too fast and too impressionistic. So a lot of people that were used to the art that preceded were very discouraged with it. So artists would quickly sketch to preserve an idea of what to paint more carefully at a later date. Okay, so characteristics of Impressionism. Let's look at the brushstrokes. Dappling effects of light, shadows contain color, times of day, seasons of the year affect appearances of objects. So as you look at one of these paintings, you're not looking at light the way Rembrandt, a very important artist who was known for his lighting, which was always in the center of the picture, or Johann Vermeer, who was also known for his night lighting technique, and his lighting would come in from a window. Or you also had, besides Rembrandt and Vermeer, you've also had other artists where you had chiaroscuro, for instance, and you would have lighting that was in part of the painting and the other part was in darkness, like in the Caravaggios that we see in the church art that was several centuries earlier. Let's look at the concept of plein air. En plein air is a French term, and it means in the outside. Painting in the outdoors to directly capture effects of light and atmosphere on a given object. So what was the color range here? From subtle harmonies to stark contrast and brilliant hues. So this is kind of interesting when you think about it. You're looking at a color range that it says it can be subtle and they're harmonious, they kind of work together, to like a stark contrast, meaning it's really, really obvious that you have one color here and one color here, and then brilliant hues. Okay, and then your landscape and still life painting are from an urban point of view. So you have two words that I would like to review with you. Urban, which means city-like, and then you have country, which if we were to be looking at Bruegels, which is one of the most famous of the artists that were the antithesis of urban, it would be Bruegel, and it was all peasant and rural life. Okay, so an acronym is a series of words that if you take the first letter, they'll spell a word. In this case, we're gonna look at the acronym known as ELBO. Okay, and this will help us to remember the characteristics of Impressionism. And so, what are they? Environment, light, brush strokes, outdoors or en plein air, and weather. Okay, so if we look at this painting right here, this is the Saint Lazare station. You will, and it's a train station in France. So look at how you just vaguely see the trains, you vaguely see the people, you vaguely see the buildings in the background, right? But we do see an environment, we do see light with the use of color. We see the brush strokes, they're very obvious. They're trying to have you be aware of those. You see that this is outdoors, so en plein air, and you see the weather. When you see clouds, it's always about weather. Okay? So let's take a look at some of these artists. You have Degas, and Degas had an interesting oeuvre. And oeuvre is also a French word that has to do with the works of a particular artist. Then Monet with the water lilies, one of the artists that is very renowned in Impressionism, and he had water lilies, but he also did a lot of other things. Then Renoir, who had a lot of outdoor scenes on plein air, and he had a lot of very elegant Parisians. And then Berthe Morisot, who was also an Impressionist artist that dealt with, her themes were mostly including women and children. So Claude Monet, Edouard Manet, Auguste Renoir, Edgar Degas, Berthe Morisot, and on this page we don't have him, but Alfred Sisley. Okay, I had the privilege and the blessing of being able to travel to Giverny, France with my husband. We saw the house of Claude Monet, and you will recognize here the bridge that he had for the water lilies paintings. Okay, this is the dance class by Edgar Degas, and one is in New York and the other is in Paris. If you look at this carefully, you're going to see that you have the director of the class, and then you have the ballerinas. But notice that this area right here in particular is different from this area here, And so if you take just a brief look, you might think, oh, it's the same painting. It's not the same painting. It's a group of ballerinas, they're in a class, but notice how elaborate this this doorway and frame are. And this one is very plain, and the lighting on the floor is similar but not exact, and the conductor's attire is also of a different color. Okay, now let's look at Auguste Renoir and dancers from the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. And I want to review a little bit about the famous museums that we have in Paris, France. This is one of the great areas. In fact, Paris was not just a great area and location for art, but it was the center of the art world for many, many years. And so, as we had discussed just a moment ago, Auguste Renoir would have beautiful scenes of Parisians dancing, eating, drinking, having a good time. Okay, let's now look at Post-Impressionism. So this emerged as a reaction against Impressionism and the concern for the naturalistic depiction of light and color. Now we have a broad emphasis on abstract qualities or symbolic content. Post-Impressionism encompasses Neo-Impressionism and symbolism. So within a particular movement, you can have sub-movements. You also have extended Impressionism while rejecting its limitations. Similarities. So let's look at the similarities between one and another. The use of vivid colors, often thick application of paint and real-life subject matter, and differences, more inclined to emphasize geometric forms and distort form for expressive effect and use unnatural or arbitrary color. Okay, so the use of vivid colors, the thick application of paint, you can actually see the thickness in the brush strokes. The differences is that they were more inclined to emphasize geometric forms, distort form for expressive effect, and use unnatural or arbitrary colors. Okay, now, if you are painting and you're using an unnatural or arbitrary color, what this means is that these are not typically the colors that would be used to paint something. If you're painting a cloud, you would generally paint it white or blue, but you would not necessarily paint it maybe bright orange or green. Okay, so here we have The Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh at the MoMA in New York City, which is one of the greatest paintings of all times. And then post-impressionistic artists, let's take a look. So Paul Cézanne, who happens to be known as the father of post-impressionism, Paul Gauguin, Vincent van Gogh, and Georges Seurat. Mont Sainte-Victoire by Paul Cézanne. Okay, you will notice Mrs. Kep here in different attire, and you will notice different colored walls. The reason for this is because this is in various and sundry museums around the world. And Paul Cézanne painted close to 80 watercolor and oil paintings of Mont Sainte-Victoire, which means Mount Saint Victoire. It's a particular mount in France that he loved to go and look at and paint on plein air. So these are different renditions. Okay, pardon me. Now, Paul Gauguin, where do we come from? What are we and where are we going? Of all, Paul Gauguin, let me tell you a little bit about the history of Paul Gauguin. Paul Gauguin was a young man that from the earliest of times when he was a youth, he was very interested in painting. and he would always dabble in painting. And then he was married and had 5 children. He was not financially successful enough for his wife's desire, and so Paul Gauguin was asked to leave the family, and he decided to go to the islands. He went to Tahiti, and while he was there, it was the custom for older men to be with younger women. And so he was a man in his 40s, and he was dating girls that were in their teens. Now, to us, that seems very strange and not what we're accustomed to, but we always have to look at things in context. What was acceptable and what was the normal thing to do at a particular time? So, you see here the effect of Egyptian figures that are kind of staid and dogmatic, sort of speaking. You also see the effects of Japanism, and we see Tahitian imagery as well. And when you can always spot a Gauguin, because the vast majority of his work will have taken place in Tahiti, and it will have women and men from Tahiti in various and sundry activities taking place. Okay, and now on to symbolism. Okay, reaction against the literal world of realism. So in realism, they wanted to say, hey, you know, it is what it is. I'm going to show you the good, the bad, the ugly. I'm not going to sugarcoat anything. And now, with symbolism, they're saying, we think you went a little too far. Let's kind of change things up a bit. And so what happens now? Unforeseen forces of life, things that are deeply felt rather than merely seen. Modern psychic life, dreams, imagination, fantasy, and inner experiences are the inspiration behind this art. So in this case, we have The Scream by Edvard Munch, and he was from Scandinavia. And this was, he had severe mental health conditions that he expressed here, and this has become such an iconic work. It is one of the most iconic pieces in the story of art history. He remembers being on a bridge, and he remembers 2 people walking, and he remembers that all of a sudden he had a panic attack. And look at the way he has chosen to express that through the art. Every time you see lines that are not vertical or horizontal, they're showing you movement. So you see the water, you see the sky being portrayed with a color palette that you wouldn't necessarily expect, particularly in the sky, and that's what we had talked about previously. Okay, this was an exhibition that I was very privileged to attend, Edvard Munch in Dialogue, and this was in Austria. Okay, and speaking of art of Austria, we have now Art Nouveau, roughly between 1890 and 1914. So this did not, it says World War I. World War I was 1914 to 1918, but this kind of is the period leading up to World War I. So we have the elimination of separation of various artistic media to combine into one unified experience. Okay, what does that mean? In Art Nouveau, you have this, usually an inclination to have a figure, but rather than just a figure, here we have 2 figures. We have a man, we have a woman, we have a type of pedestal, we have their feet that are coming off, they're almost like at the edge. Here we have rectangles and circles, and here we have circles, and this was supposed to be an imagery of sperm and egg for the female. And look at the neck and the embrace of these two figures. So no straight lines, you have an accentuation of the curvy linear, and you have vegetal and floral patterns, complexity of design, and undulating surfaces. Anything undulating is something that goes like this. Okay, so this is in a museum in Vienna, Austria, and this is the kiss. So by having Mrs. Kep in front, you get an idea of the scope of the size of the work. Okay, now we're going to look into 19th century architecture, the late 19th century. So there's a popular use of skeletal architecture. What is skeletal architecture? Okay, when a building is held up by an interior framework that's called the skeleton. The exterior wall being a mere curtain made of glass and steel that keeps out the weather. So you have this structure that has been composed, and you're kind of putting a veneer around it. So what are the characteristics? It's skeletal, we just went over that. You have an emphasis on verticality. Think of a skyscraper. Skyscraper, when you think of a skyscraper, it's a very, very tall building, so you're thinking up and vertical. Use of building is ceramic terracotta casings with iron underneath. And then you have open and wide window spaces for window displays and elevators. A very important thing when you're talking about a skyscraper that could have 30, 40, 50, 60, 80 floors high. Okay, so now we're going to look at the art movements of the 20th century. Fauvism, Cubism, German Expressionism, Dada, Harlem Renaissance, Constructivism, Surrealism, De-Stijl, Mexican Muralism, Abstract Expressionism, Pop Art Happenings, Color Field, Earth Art and or Side Art, and Postmodernism. I would like you to please do this exercise, as I know that some of you were always using a translator as we looked at this. These are very, at this material. Art history is a very nuanced, complex, cultured, and very lofty concept in our studies. And so what I would suggest, and I would request that you do, is that I'm going to go over these words again, and I want you to repeat them after I say them so that we can remember the pronunciation. So, Fauvism, after the Fauves, which were the wild people, the wild animals. Cubism, German Expressionism, Dada or Dadaism, the Harlem Renaissance, Constructivism, Surrealism, De-Stijl, Mexican Muralism, Abstract Expressionism, Pop Art, Happenings, Color Field, Earth Art and or Site Art, meaning you can use these terms interchangeably, and Postmodernism. Okay, let's look at the Fauves and Fauvism. So Fauvism was a movement that developed in France. It was the first new artistic style of the 20th century. So what are the characteristics? Pure, vivid color, bold, distinctive brushwork. Fauvism means wild beasts. Okay, Fauvist art contrasted so strikingly from traditional art that critic Louis Vauxhall described the artist as Les Fauves, or wild beast. And one of the notable artists was Henri Matisse. Now, I want you to take a look at a couple of things. First, let's take a look at this work. So you had pure, vivid color, bold, distinctive brushwork, the concept of the wild beast, because they thought that this was so different that they're like, these people are wild. And le fauve, this is in French. So les is plural, le is singular, so it's the fauves. And the artist that we're looking at here is Henri Matisse. And looking at Matisse a little closer, the background of his paintings always looked as if though it was a paper, wallpaper background. And the reason he was so enamored of goldfish was he took a trip to Morocco and he saw people sitting in the middle of the day just meditating, sitting by waters, little ponds with goldfish, and he thought, I really like this. Notice that he's not concerned with 3D dimensions or making something look like it's very realistic, not at all. Okay, and a lot of his motifs were goldfish and or women reclining, and spaces that were rooms for painting, like his studio. Okay, so here we have two images of a goldfish by Henri Matisse. The original we saw is from Moscow, which is this one. So because of the situation with Russia being involved with the Ukraine now, there isn't a whole lot of travel. Whenever a country has a war going on, there's not a lot of travel. So the good news is that Matisse has many paintings of goldfish that we can look at. So this was from this particular one was from 1912. It has an Asian quality to it and a meditative state of mind, alluding back to what I had just told you regarding the fact that he had taken a trip to Morocco and became very enamored of this. Okay, so let's look at Fauvism and other examples. Okay, so here we have Henri Matisse, Luxe, Calme et Volupté from the Musée d'Orsay. So we see a scene where we have what is known in art as punctillism, where you have little dots everywhere. And the artist Seurat painted always in punctillism. So we see a little scene outside. Now here we have another Matisse called Bonheur de Vivre, or The Joy of Life, and this was painted between 1905 and 1906, oil on canvas. And this particular one is at the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, and this at the Musée d'Orsay. Okay, so let's look at Luxe, Calme et Volupté. This one is at the George Pompidou because Matisse had more than one rendition of this. Okay, and then The Joy of Life at the Barn. We see nudes reclining, nudes bathing, and a very idyllic scene. Okay, now we're going to jump to something radically different known as German Expressionism. Okay, so in German Expressionism, we had the emphasis of emotional impact over descriptive accuracy. They were not concerned in having a hand look like a hand or a nose look like a nose, but rather they wanted to have you look at a work and be impacted emotionally. Okay, so you had two groups within the German Expressionism. You had Die Brücke, which was the bridge in German, and Der Blaue Reiter, which was the Blue Rider. Okay, so they were influenced by the spiritual interests of the Romantics and the Symbolics. Remember the Romantics with Courbet and having everything, it was the last thing from Romantic. This period was the last thing from Romantic. And then Symbolism was the one that the item that we saw with the Scream by Edvard Munch, which was also wanting to portray feelings and emotions. So this sought to express a profound emotional experience rather than depicting the visible exterior of subjects. Okay, so let's take a look. The Die Brücke, or the bridge. So its desire was to serve as a bridge from the present to the future. Okay? One artist that was very prevalent at this time was Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. He was influenced by the 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, and the context and who his audience was intended was an audience that was modern, young, vital, and urban. And by means of a review, remember that urban is city. He's not looking at the uneducated, he's not looking at people that work on farms or rural areas. He's looking at urban areas and people that are educated and people that are young and vital. Okay, so what is his style? It's bright, arbitrary colors, and a primitive aesthetic. So let's see what that means and break it down a little bit. Bright colors as opposed to a very subtle ochre color, or the colors that we saw in realism, which were very muted. So arbitrary means that we decide to take a color that's not usually used to express something in particular. We bring in a totally different color altogether. So, and a primitive aesthetic. Primitive means getting at the base of something. It's not trying to have something very orchestrated, something that's very refined, but it's very guttural. It's coming from your gut. So what are your themes? Anxiety. You're anxious, you're depressed. Usually anxiety and depression are two sides of the same coin. Alienation. This is what we experienced right after COVID. We had to spend so much time on our own and separated from other people, and this has taken a tremendous toll, particularly on young people that had to stay home and miss out on some formative years of their education. And also you had sexually charged themes, like the female nude. Now, a sexually charged theme, or anything that is sexually charged, means something that's very provocative, either in the dress or lack thereof. You could have a nude or somebody that's dressed but with something so flimsy that it's see-through, or just the very nature of it is very provocative and sensual looking. In the background we see an image. That's the one that is probably Kirchner's most important work. Now we're going to look at Der Blaue Reiter, the Blue Rider. So here we have a motif of a horse and rider, often used by the founding member, who was Vasily Kandinsky. And you can also pronounce it Wasili. In America, it's pronounced Vasily. So what were the influences? Medieval traditions, folk art of Kandinsky's Russian homeland. The audience was modern, young, vital and urban, once again. The style was formal, elements of color, line, like music, could evoke an emotional response in the viewer, and the themes were spiritual, symbolisms, and allusions to ethereal concerns. Okay, and here we have in the Guggenheim in New York City, one of Vasily Kandinsky's most important works, which is called Improvisation 28. When we get to this artist specifically, because this is an overview of the movements, we will look at this piece with more detail. Okay, and the next item that we're going to cover is called New Objectivity, and this is where we will pick up on the next set of slides. Thank you so much for your attention.